welcome to another conversation about what truly goes on in Rwanda. My name is Denise Zaneza, and it is always my pleasure to be your host on the different topics we shall be having regarding the ongoing human rights violations, the oppression, the closed political space in Rwanda, and much more about Paul Kagame's brutal dictatorship. While Paul Kagame's regime is portrayed as a model of success and democracy, the reality is very far from the picture we are used to seeing in the media due to the strong and very expensive PR machine behind the scenes. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of expression are essentially non existent in modern Rwanda. And this situation is mainly enforced by severe punishment towards any dissenting voice. Paul Kagame's record of human rights violations goes beyond the Rwandan borders. His regime has become an expert when it comes to transnational repression. To help us navigate this topic and the UK-Rwanda deportation plan, we are joined by a distinguished guest, Michela Wrong. Michela is an author and a journalist who brings remarkable knowledge, value, and insight to today's conversation. Good evening, Michela.
Good evening, Denise.
Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Before we dive into our conversation for our audience, who's Michela Wrong?
Okay, well, I am a 63-year-old journalist and writer. I am half English and half Italian. My mother is Italian. I spent most of my career working for Reuters and the Financial Times. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my career, I wasn't in Africa at all. I was based in Rome and Paris and Europe. And then eventually I got a posting to Côte d'Ivoire. And started doing some African reporting. And then I had another posting in Kinshasa, in what was then Zaire. And that happened to be the year of the genocide in Rwanda, as you're well aware. So I covered the genocide for Reuters and then joined the Financial Times and did a lot of reporting on the Great Lakes during that period, on the fall of Mobutu, him fleeing the country. The rise, all the incredible events that happened in Congo, and also the establishment of the RPF, of Kagame's new government. But I was also, I think sometimes people assume that my only subject has ever been Rwanda, but in fact, I was covering at one stage 43 African countries, so I was traveling all the time. And my other books have been about Kenya, about Eritrea, about Zaire, Mobutu Zaire. And, only recently did I come back to the subject of Rwanda with my last book, Do Not Disturb, in English, which has been translated as Rwanda, Assassination sans frontières in French just last year.
Exactly. Amazing, impressive resume, Michela. And that is the reason why I invited you to today's conversation. As we all saw it, Paul Kagame has once again stole the election by preventing real opponents from participating. For example, Victoire Ingabire wasn't allowed to participate, though she had every right to. Also, other Rwandan politicians living abroad could not. And one of Kagame's favorite tool and tactic to silence dissenting voices and making sure that no one can stand against him is transnational repression, which we'll be talking about today. This practice includes harassment, surveillance, intimidation, and sometimes assassinations against Rwandans in exile, diaspora members, and foreigners linked in any way to Rwandan affairs. We have seen countless reports that show how the Rwandan government has targeted and is still targeting human rights defenders, journalists, civil society activists, and political opponents, among others. Michela, as a journalist yourself, when was the first time you saw or heard of the transnational repression carried out by Paul Kagame's regime?
Well, I was living in Nairobi for 4 years, from 95 to 99. And while I was living there and covering the whole of Africa, Seth Sendashonga, the former interior minister, former member of the RPF, was assassinated. And it was the second attempt. There had been a first botched attempt, which had involved Jack Nziza, as most people know. And this second attempt in 1998 was successful, and Seth Sendashonga died in his car. And I remember sort of seeing this news and thinking, oh my goodness, what has happened? Because I had interviewed Seth Sendashonga when he was an interior minister and had just left the government in Kigali, and thinking, oh, what on earth happened? And I have to say that I didn't pay the event as much attention as I should have done, because, as I said, Rwanda was just one of the many countries I covered. This was an exiled interior minister who was accused by the RPF of setting up an armed militia. I mean, all the evidence pointed to the fact that it was the Rwandan government that had ordered his killing and had arranged it. But it was kind of like, you just thought, internal problems, not something that I can explain to my newspaper, which had, a limited appetite for news from Africa. So I don't think I even wrote about it. But obviously, looking back, you think that was an absolutely key moment in the history of the RPF. There had been killings, assassinations beforehand of people, who had fled abroad, who had been key members of the RPF. But that was the biggest kind of assassination, the biggest player who was taken out by the RPF, and I should have paid more attention than I did at the time. Of course, after that, we saw that syndrome continuing. But I think for me, one of the moments where I really thought, oh my goodness, what is taking place in Rwanda, was when there was an attempted assassination on General Kayumba Nyamwasa in 2010. So a good long time after the Seth Sendashonga attacks. And this was when he was shot at with his wife, coming back to his house in South Africa, where he was living in exile, having set up an opposition party with Patrick Karegeya, the former intelligence chief, and he escaped. He survived. But I remember thinking, oh, that's really interesting, because, of course, like most people who covered Rwanda, I was aware that General Kayumba Nyamwasa was a member of that Tutsi elite, that he had played, he had been the former head of the chief of armed forces. This was a man who'd been very, very close to Kagame. And you kind of thought, oh, this is interesting that Kagame is now turning on the people who were closest to him, who were a key part of his regime. And then, of course, finally, there was, of course, the strangling in the hotel room of Patrick Karegeya, former head of external intelligence, who I had known because journalists were often sort of taken to see Patrick Karegeya when they were applying for interviews with Paul Kagame, the president. I sort of thought, oh my God, and it was very widely known that at one stage Patrick Karegeya had been very good friends with Paul Kagame. So you sort of think, and of course everyone knew that he was also a member of that RPF Tutsi elite who had come over from Uganda in 1990. So this was once again someone very much part of that internal, that coterie, that elite running the country, who had turned against Kagame, criticized him, set up an opposition party after fleeing the country. And that struck me as an extraordinary event. And that's why I started looking and researching my book.
Wow, amazing. Like you just illustrated, there's no limit to Kagame's regime when it comes to revenge and brutality. Because, like Seth Sendashonga was a key player, in the RPF, and he's done many things to help the RPF get in power. But from the moment he started talking about the human rights violations and what was going on, and the murders and the human rights violations that were being committed, they turned against him. Patrick Karegeya, same thing, when he and Kayumba Nyamwasa, when they started the opposition against Kagame. So this truly shows that the official narrative that we are told in the media has nothing to do with the reality, and the atrocities committed that or are still being committed by the RPF regime under Paul Kagame are becoming more and more public knowledge.
Yes.
And this is a very good thing, and it's amazing how much people are talking, how much it is being covered in different medias. And Michela, this is absolutely appalling because some Western leaders continue to ignore this and choose to stand by Paul Kagame, and for the sake of their own political careers, of course, and all the benefits that come with them. But this is a huge problem for the victims who are targeted and find themselves in real danger for speaking out or for addressing human rights violation issues in Rwanda. And this brings me to my second question. Have you been a victim yourself? And how did you or how do you cope and manage if this is still going on?
Well, I think, transnational repression is a big term and a big
Indeed.
concept. And I mean, the first time I read that term was in a report written by Freedom House, which is an NGO based in the States, which has done some really, really compelling, very well resourced, very well researched, rather, reports about Rwanda's record on transnational repression. And I would recommend that anyone listening to this goes and reads those reports because they update them, they keep them up to date. Freedom House is one of several human rights groups that really have looked very closely at Rwanda's record on transnational repression. The other ones, of course, are Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So the first time I heard that phrase, was when I was reading the reports, and it really covers a whole gamut of behaviour which is actually fairly rare, to my mind, in Africa, because transnational repression basically means a state reaching across its own borders to pursue dissidents, perceived rivals, perceived critics, perceived enemies. And of course, that tends to include not only members of opposition parties in exile, but also analysts, human rights campaigners, journalists, writers. And the gamut, Rwanda has run the gamut of targeting people for assassination, as we've just been discussing, and succeeding in assassinating people. It's also had lots of failed assassination attempts, against, for example, General Kayumba Nyamwasa, but also against Theogene Rudasingwa, the former General Secretary of the RPF, and several others. But it also includes, of course, disappearances, people just disappearing without a trace. There are lots of high-profile Rwandans who are believed to be dead, but we don't know what happened to them. Journalists sort of being beaten up and killed. Most of these attempts, of course, happen in other African countries, especially Uganda and Kenya, because those are easy, and South Africa, those are easy places for Rwanda to send its agents. And we've also seen a lot of attacks in Mozambique, which is another easy place for Rwandan agents to get to. But we have also seen attacks on people, Rwandans living in Belgium, in France, in my own country, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, as far as Australia, in the States, in Canada. And these attacks, in Sweden and Scandinavia, but in these cases, often it's about intimidating people, beating them up, persuading them that they must remain silent and not engage in political activities, trying to also to bully them often into going back home, where they can be more easily controlled.
Yes.
And of course, mostly the victims of what I'm describing are mostly Rwandans. But it also does include people like me, Westerners who dare to write or analyze or talk about what's going on in Rwanda. So basically, any academic or analyst or journalist or author who expresses views openly that are critical of the government can find themselves targeted. And it's a very, very common experience. And what the routine, what happens is of course the knee-jerk thing is to immediately accuse someone because I'm white, so it's very easy. The first thing you do is accuse me of being a racist, neo-colonialist. But then of course we're talking about Rwanda, a country in which the accusation of being a genocide denier has become a favorite accusation. And it is used now, it seems to me, almost with anyone who criticizes the government. They are automatically accused of being a genocide denier. So that is one of the allegations logged against me. I always say, this is ridiculous. I reported on the genocide. Of course, I'm not a denier. How could I deny something that I reported on?
That you reported in, yes.
Yeah, I mean, what am I, crazy? But of course, there's a reason that is the favorite allegation, because it shocks audiences in the West who immediately think, oh my God, she's like the people who deny the Holocaust. And also, it's genocide denial is a crime in Rwanda. And so it immediately basically turns anyone who's a critic of Kagame into a criminal who would risk being arrested if they were to go to Rwanda. So it's a very deliberate accusation, very cynically used. And I've had that it actually started even before my book came out in English in 2021. There was already a petition being circulated that had been signed by members of the Rwandan government. I think they were relevant. Who were told, to denounce me as a racist and try and target the organization that had agreed to host my event. And it has continued since then. So I've had sort of 3 years of solid harassment, intimidation, smears. A lot of them have been very misogynistic and sexual because, of course, I'm a woman. So that's what you accuse. You always accuse a woman of being a whore. That's what comes naturally to,
We're used to that, yes.
Of the Rwandan regime, that it has this reputation in the West of being sort of pro-women, and you kind of think, well, strangely enough, that's not been my experience. I think it's a very sexist and misogynistic regime, and I've experienced that myself. But the allegations are always made the same, and then on top of that, I'm accused of being a spy and having worked for the French, or having spied for the Ugandans or the Americans or the British. So it's a sort of bevy of accusation, and it is unrelenting, because of course the Rwandan regime has a lot of people who are willing to do this work in intelligence and in the police force. It also employs lobbying companies. The PR company Chelgate, the British company Chelgate, was at one stage coordinating a lot of these attacks. But also there are a lot of young Rwandans, I think, who are out of jobs, who are active on social media, and they think that by tweeting about me, usually they use anonymous accounts, and by saying she's a racist, she's a genocide denier, that they will eventually get a job in government, because they'll have shown their loyalty to the regime. Yeah, so I've had events in Britain. I've had an event in Belgium. I've been very public about discussing that, where I was supposed last year to present my book and have a discussion about the situation in Rwanda. And basically the restaurant in Brussels where we were supposed to stage the event was targeted with this sort of onslaught of social media campaign. And there were some 3 Rwandans who went to the restaurant where we were supposed to be staging the venue and threaten the staff if they were going to agree to continue with the event. So not surprisingly, that restaurant cancelled, and we had to scramble and find another event. I've had this similar thing happen in South Africa, where I was due to talk at a think tank called the ISS, and they cancelled on me at the morning where we were supposed to be staging the event, because their director had been told by Rwandan officials that a joint project that they were working on in Addis Ababa would be cancelled if they had gone ahead with this, what was supposed to be a Zoom interview. And recently, amazingly, recently I went to Australia and New Zealand, and I was giving some talks about Rwanda. And in New Zealand, for some reason, the regime decided it was unacceptable that I should be holding various talks with a think tank based in New Zealand, and they launched this blizzard, this sort of tsunami of hostile tweets, in which once again I was being accused of being a racist and a genocide denier, and it was extraordinary. I've never seen the like. At one stage there were 42 2 tweets in the space of a couple of minutes. And you just sort of think,
They're very coordinated, yes.
They're incredibly coordinated. I think that we're seeing now they're moving from using people to probably using bots and programs that just keep pumping out these tweets. I mean, if you call up these, they're known as sock puppet accounts. And if you call them up, you'll always see that there's a fake name, a fake profile. It's always been an account that's been very recently set up. And they'll have something like 3 followers or 7 followers. So one of my little pastimes that I go in for is to denounce these people on Twitter and say, how come you've only got 7 followers? What's wrong with you? Kagame is going to be very disappointed because you're not really doing very well. And I just like to call them out because it's obvious. I mean, when you see an account like that, it's obvious that it's not a genuine member of the Rwandan public who feels strongly about me and my work. It's either a member of the police, the intelligence service, or it's a bot, or it's one of these young Rwandans who are desperately hoping to be employed, by the government at some stage.
Yes, and there's also this sort of wanting to belong to the regime and to be acknowledged. And Kagame himself and even the First Lady, they incite people to, to attack others on social media who tell the truth about Rwanda, what is going on. And since they don't want that truth to come out, they incite them to go and fight against them and fight against us or anyone who brings light to what is really going on. It's amazing. It's really sad. And really, on behalf of the Rwandan community, thank you, Michela, for not giving up, because it's not easy. You don't give up despite the dangers, the threats, the insults, because the goal is to silence the truth. But you have decided to never give in, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Denise. I mean, it's a lot easier for me because I'm not Rwandan. I don't have family in Rwanda. I don't have assets in Rwanda that can be seized, because we know that the government does that with critics of Kagame. I don't have an old auntie who I'm worried about. I don't have children there. So I can be a lot more open in my views, and I'm privileged in that way. I'm very, very lucky. But that's also why I keep doing it, because I sort of feel, I have that protection and that safety. And if I'm not going to be honest about what I think, well, why should I expect Rwandans to take those risks? I mean, what we're seeing increasingly, if you read the last Human Rights Watch report called Join Us or Die, it came out in October, and what it logs is the way in which people, Rwandans living abroad, who maybe have played no role in politics whatsoever, have really kept their heads down, didn't want to get involved. They're now being rung and contacted by members of their family living in Rwanda who are saying, you have to come back. We are coming under pressure from the authorities. You have to come back, because obviously the authorities are worried that one day that person might become politically active, or maybe the idea is that they've got jobs in the West and they're contributing to the anti-Kagame sort of community out there in one way or another, and they're putting a lot of pressure on families. They're arresting people, detaining people. People are disappearing, and it's all aimed at putting pressure on Rwandans abroad to basically bring them to heel. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in, and I think it hasn't received enough attention at all, is the way in which this is it's happening in Europe, but it is particularly happening in Southern Africa. So we know that the Rwandan communities in places like Malawi, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Tanzania, and there are large communities in all those countries, and they have people who've been settled there, set up businesses. They are coming under intense pressure from the authorities in those countries, who have now, in many cases, have signed deals with the Rwandan head of police, and they are being told, you have to go back home. or they're being put under pressure to sign up and become members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or to log their companies and make sure that their business proceeds go through a Rwandan bank. And it's all an attempt by Kigali to basically bring this community under control and to monitor it, to ensure its loyalty. And I don't think that whole operation has received enough attention. It's been going on for several years now, and it's very, very difficult for the people, the Rwandans who are living in those countries, because they don't have the support in many cases of the governments, the host governments where they are living.
Well, this is why it is very important to speak up. And I can only encourage my fellow Rwandans to not be afraid. I know there are risks, of course, but speak up if you cannot speak up yourself. Get someone who's not afraid to speak up, to talk about those issues, because if we don't do it, they will continue. And Paul Kagame is a businessman above all, and he is leading a criminal regime on top of it, and this transnational repression is about control, making sure that everyone is in check and that he stays in power for as long as possible. So let's move on to the UK-Rwanda deportation.
Yeah, sure.
This is practically old news by now, since the plan was
well, I'm very glad that it is old news, because I was one of many people who thought it was a grotesque plan. It appealed to all the worst instincts in my fellow British nationals. It was a plan that many people rightly said would have meant that my country would have been violating the Refugee Convention, and might have meant that Britain would have left various European human rights conventions that it signed up for decades ago. So it was a very far right, ridiculous scheme. Just recently, I mean, the Labour Party, when it was in opposition, had always said it would scrap the scheme, which was one of the reasons why it was so ridiculous that the Conservative Party kept insisting and kept pushing it through, because they knew that it was quite likely to be scrapped, because they were not, predicted and expected to win the election.
Yes, and that's the first thing that happened when
and the first thing that Keir Starmer, our new Prime Minister, did at his first press conference he gave is he said, okay, the deal is scrapped. So that was very satisfying. And Yvette Cooper, who is our new Home Secretary, i.e. our Interior Minister, just gave recently a speech in Parliament where she outlined that not only has Britain spent an astonishing £700 million, not dollars, pounds, on the scheme, a scheme which ended up with only 4 people, and they were volunteers. They weren't people who were deported. They were people who volunteered. Only 4 people went to Rwanda. And that the whole scheme ended up, Rwanda made £290 million worth out of it. Lucky Rwanda. The whole scheme was apparently scheduled to cost £10 billion, something that was never mentioned in Parliament, never got any approval. So I think there will probably be a major investigation into this scheme, because it's very hard to work out how that kind of money was handed over without any real oversight. So it's a very big change in policy. I think it has all sorts of implications for Rwanda. I mean, the Labour Party have been very complimentary about Rwanda. They said, we don't blame Rwanda. This was, what we blame the Conservative Party. But I think the impression I get is that because Rwanda is associated with this grotesque, inappropriate deal that everyone agreed was in violation of all sorts of human rights conventions, and Rwanda is now associated with that deal, that will have an impact on the way the new government, the Labour Party, views Rwanda. And we have a new foreign minister called David Lammy, who has In the past, he has expressed, what everyone knows about the M23 rebel movement, which is active and has seized all this territory in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. And he's sort of said, it's ridiculous. We know that Rwanda is behind the M23. Why isn't that being called out? And I think, what we saw during the last few years, in which basically what happened was, as soon as the deal between Home Secretary Priti Patel and the Rwandan foreign minister was signed, Britain went silent on Rwanda's human rights violations, its behavior, its military intervention in Congo, and all the things that normally the British government, as a major donor, would have been quite open about and spoken about. So it basically silenced itself. It self-censored from then on, because it cared more about that deal. And I think that is now going to be at an end, and that's very, very welcome, because we've had this omerta on the part of Britain. We've also seen that France doesn't want to speak honestly about what's going on, although they have actually made more forthright comments than Britain has over the last few years. And so we've got two major donors, which are for self-interested reasons. With Britain, it was the asylum seekers. With France, it was the fact that Rwandan peacekeepers were protecting its Total installation in Mozambique.
Yes.
They were self-censoring and not saying what everyone knew, which is M23 is a Rwandan puppet. If we want to stop the war and the violence and the creation of all these millions of displaced people in Congo, Rwanda has to stop doing what it's doing. We have an influence because we are donors. Rwanda relies on our aid. We can make clear our disapproval and stop this from happening. And none of that was happening because of the asylum deal and the Total operation. So I think there's hope that there will be a shift now in behavior by some key Western allies. And it may not be enough, because at the end of the day, America, of course, is the most important donor, and America has been very, very tough in what it says publicly towards Kagame, and very tough in sort of saying, we know that you're behind M23, we know you have troops inside Congo, you have to stop this, it's unacceptable. But America hasn't done anything but announce.
We still don't see sanctions.
Yeah, we've not seen feisty sanctions like we did in 2012. We've seen sanctions against some fairly junior people. But I think we're coming a little bit closer with this change of government in Britain to a shift in policy and a shift in approach by the West towards Rwanda over this issue.
Amazing. So indeed, let's hope that the policy is going to shift in the right direction this time. And of course, like we mentioned before, Rwanda, and by Rwanda, I mean Paul Kagame's regime, is being more and more exposed as it really is, and not as their PR machine wants us to believe. Thank you, Michela, for your insight on this. And as we are moving to the end of our conversation, let's talk about your new book, La chute du léopard. What should we expect from it?
Well, I have to be honest and say I wrote the book a very long time ago. It was my first book, and it was about Mobutu Sese Seko, Zairian president, known as the Leopard, and his rise and fall, because I was there when his regime came to an end. I was living in, I lived in Kinshasa in one of the last years that he was there, and then I was one of the journalists who were in Kinshasa when the AFDL rebels, supported by Rwanda, marched into Kinshasa. So it was, when I wrote that book, it was my first book, and I wanted to just kind of describe, how Mobutu became who he was, how he was propped up by the West. We know, of course, what happened to Patrice Lumumba, who, at a certain point, the CIA tried to have him killed, and then in the end he was killed by separatists supported by the Belgian government. And then Mobutu takes over. But really what I wanted to describe in that book was the Zaire that I lived in and had come to see, because it was a country that had been just destroyed by top-level looting, by Mobutu's inability to do anything approaching running the country's finances, the endless printing of money, the fact that when I lived there we had 9,000% inflation, that you know, everyone, there was this wonderful article that everyone used to joke about. It was a mythical article in the Constitution called Article 15, which was how you survive in Zaire when the system doesn't work, and there were all these surreal kind of survival strategies, double jobs, little scams that people were running to just survive. And I thought it was a fascinating society, because it was a society where the structures of the state had stopped working and the normal economy had stopped working, but people were discovering alternatives and being very inventive and somehow retaining their dignity. So I wrote about that, and I wrote it in English. It came out. It's been a bestseller of mine ever since. And I never managed to persuade a French publisher to show any interest, because the French, I think, always think that they have nothing to learn from English speakers about Francophone African countries. But it was great that I managed to get a grant to get the book translated, and my French publisher said, sure, let's bring it out. And I'm just going to be interested to see how it does, because of course Mobutu, although, you know, he left in 1997, he's still very relevant. You know, the problems that Congo is having, DRC is having in the East, are really the legacy of Mobutu. I mean, this is a man who destroyed his own army because he was scared of there being a military coup. So he kind of used to set up one elite, force of presidential guard after another, and all the generals were kind of warring against one another, and he would make the same promises to all of them, and there were sort of thousands and thousands of supposed Rwandan soldiers who didn't really exist, and all of their, sorry, not Rwandans, Congolese, Zairean soldiers who were on the payroll but didn't exist, these ghost soldiers. And then, you know, all of the, every month when they were supposed to be paid, there would be this ripple of tension that would go across Kinshasa. I remember it well, because everyone would be waiting to see if they had been paid, because everyone knew that in 1991 and 1993, when the soldiers had not been paid, or they were paid with a currency that was not accepted by many traders, they went on the rampage, and they destroyed, they looted their way across the major cities of the country, and then the public joined in. So there was always this tension of like, have the soldiers been paid? Have they been paid their salaries? So I think, you know, Congo today hasn't yet recovered from Mobutu, and that's why I think the book will sell in French. You know, it's great that it's now out of French, because it's still relevant. And it's been really interesting as well to see this kind of strange nostalgia creeping in by younger people who don't remember the sort of bad things about the Mobutu years, because they weren't born or they were very, very young, and they're now sort of enjoying. There's a sort of romantic, sort of retro affection for Mobutu, for his persona, for his image, for the fact that he was respected around the world, that he used to go to Washington all the time and shake hands with whichever president was in power at the, you know, and he was invited to meet the Queen in the UK, and he had a certain style, you know, this sort of very Congolese style, and the fact that this sort of coincided with the music and the sort of this sort of sexy, flamboyant, colourful image that Congo enjoyed in the 70s and the early 80s. So there's a nostalgia for that. And I think people might be interested in just reading my assessment, because, you know, it's a mixed assessment. I try not to pull my punches and saying, you know, what obviously the terrible mistakes he made, and mostly the terrible mistakes he made were to destroy what should be a rich country's economy, just bring it to its knees, and it's never really recovered.
Well, thank you for the sneak peek on your new book. I truly recommend everyone who can to buy it and read it, because we sometimes forget that if you don't understand the past, we cannot comprehend the present. So please get yourself a copy. And for a French-speaking audience, we will soon be having another X space fully dedicated to this book, La Chute
Great.
du Léopard, in French. It will be in French, and the date and time will be announced in the days to come. So we are approaching the end, as I said earlier, and we will take 2 or 3 questions depending on the time that we have, because we only have 1 hour from the audience. I see Eric Goga is already connected. Eric, hello. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, good afternoon, Denise. Good afternoon, Michela. Thank you for this. Yeah, thank you for this presentation. Well, my question is really about what you mentioned about the PR of RPF and how the international community reacts on what's going on in Rwanda. So I always ask myself if the PR is stronger than the common sense of journalists and politicians. Why do I say that? So these days we are doing elections. Everyone who criticizes Kagame, people are bringing up his economic results. And I always not understanding how the international community gives more importance to the economic results of Paul Kagame in comparison to his human rights records and other crimes that he committed in Rwanda and also abroad. Thank you very much, Michela.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think I'm baffled in the same way as you are, and I'm particularly baffled because if you read my book, what you'll see is that in the last chapters I tackle his economic record, Kagame's economic record, and what I found, and this is happening more and more, and I think it will continue, is that if you examine closely all these claims of 8% growth rates, poverty alleviation, green revolution, and these statistics which are blindly repeated, usually by PR agencies, but also, as you say, by far too many Western journalists. They just repeat the stuff without thinking about it. When you actually look at the figures, they don't stand up to scrutiny at all. For example, we know from David Himbara, who was the economics advisor to Kagame, that the year where they announced, I think it was 11% growth, they got together in cabinet and agreed that figure. And he was saying, because he was in that inner circle, this is completely uncredible. No one will believe you. And if you look up today, Rwanda's growth for that year, it's still supposedly 11%. The British government recently hired some assessors to go to Rwanda to examine why it was that Rwanda has had, I think it was 15 years of failed poverty alleviation. And that's not what the government claims. The government claims that that poverty has been falling, dramatically. But the British government has sent people out to sort of try and find out why it is that poverty continues to be completely unchanged in Rwanda. Kagame himself has commented on the terrible malnutrition rates that are a problem, especially with children in the Rwandan rural areas. And then the other thing I point out, it's a fascinating study done by a young German researcher at London School of Economics, where he looked at the statistics for Rwanda's so-called Green Revolution. And it turns out that the statistics that were published after the various claims had been made, particularly by Kagame going abroad and telling the FAO in Rome that they'd had tripled and quadrupled harvests, that they showed that there was no green revolution in Rwanda, because the top-down strategies that embraced by the government actually didn't suit the climate and the problems faced by Rwandan farmers. So there's a lot of bluff and a lot of fakery about these figures. And there is actually, as you probably know, a Rwandan phrase for this is called "guteknika," which is like you fiddle with figures, and the white people will be impressed and fall for them. And I'm always impressed by how whenever I'm talking about Rwanda with people who work in the development sector, so many times one of them will say to me, I worked on a project in Rwanda, and when the results came out, they were really disappointing. They didn't match up with what the government wanted us to announce. And I was told just to stop fussing and not to worry. And we came out with what the government wanted us to say. So I think there's a massive disparity with the reality and what Rwanda's announcing. But this fits into this image, this PR image that Rwanda has created, that has been happily swallowed by the West. And I think one of the things we have to accept is in the West needs success stories in Africa. And very often the West looks at Africa and it thinks, oh my God, we spent all this aid on development, we've had all these relationships with all these leaderships, and look what's happening. We've got war in Ethiopia, in Sudan, we've got dictatorships, we've got military coups in the West. Thank goodness, at least there's a success story in Rwanda. And then they have to have a success story, and the fact that that all of these statistics are questionable, they just won't look at them too closely. So I think, I'm afraid, it's what is known as a Potemkin village. There's a lot of fakery going on, and I think eventually a lot of the people who've been singing Rwanda's praises will admit that the reality doesn't match up with what they've been claiming. But at the moment, that is definitely still the image that everyone is clinging to.
All right, thank you, Eric and Michela. Let's move on to Prudence. Prudence, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Denise. Thank you. Good evening, Denise. Good evening, Michela.
Good evening.
Thank you for your insights. I have two questions, actually. The first question is with regard to the situation in the DRC, in Congo. For many years, the Western countries has been praising Kagame as the man who gets things done. Kind of Rwanda is most of the most stable country in the region, the peaceful, the secure one. But now they have been going a war, aggression against DRC Congo. And we hear the condemnation from France, from USA, from Belgium. But I was wondering, I would like to hear what is your opinion about this war, why Kagame started this war. What does he want to achieve, or what are your insights when you talk with eventually Western diplomats? How they see this aggression? Because I can remember months before the aggression started, I can remember the speech of Kagame in Kigali when he was kind of irritated against the Western diplomats, and at some point he said, "If I want." Before they know, I can raise the cost. So can we say that this war against DRC is kind of raising the cost so that the Western countries still know their place, that they know that without Kagame, there's nothing that can happen in the region? I would like to know what is your thoughts about that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Prudence, for that good question. I think Kagame has been brilliant at conveying, exactly as you say, conveying the impression that he is the strong man in the region that the West can do business with, that he is effective, he's efficient, he delivers what they want. And, as I mentioned earlier, what they wanted in the case of Britain, they wanted somewhere that would take asylum seekers. And in France, they wanted someone who was willing to send peacekeepers to secure the Total installation and also pacify Central African Republic. And in America's case, they also wanted someone who might possibly be willing to send peacekeepers to the Sahel if jihadism there continues to be a major issue. So I think Kagame is absolutely brilliant in kind of offering these services. And, you know, the Rwandan army has won this reputation for being efficient, effective, uncorrupt in the countries where it operates. But I mean, what I always try and point out to people is, yeah, you know, that's great. Yes, it's performed well in Darfur. It performed well in South Sudan. It's performed apparently quite well in Central African Republic. But look at the impact of that army on the Great Lakes. Look at what it has done to Congo. Look at, you know, 1.7 million displaced people living in camps where they're catching, you know, these people are unable to farm, unable to go to proper schools, send their kids to proper schools, suffering from, you know, catching cholera, typhoid, having to be fed by bilateral donors who support Kagame in this sort of ultimate irony. Look at the kind of the impact on Burundi. Look at the strained relations which seem to sort of wax and wane with Uganda. So, you know, you cannot say that Kagame is a safe pair of hands. He may deliver a very narrow services and a performance, you know, that suits the Mozambican government in that country, but as a overall, the impact of that army and its activities, and it's the same army. Let us remember that when the EU gives money to the Rwandan army in Mozambique, it is helping the same army that is destabilizing Congo, which is one of the biggest countries in Africa and one of the most important countries. So there's a sort of failure to connect up the dots by the West, which I find is just extraordinary and completely culpable. And you wonder, you know, how people cannot see that this is the same army. So I hope that there will be a bit more focus in the future on these contradictions in Western policy. I think that Kagame is not, you know, is not a man that we can do business with the way he is sold abroad. And I think there is a bigger question that people are asking themselves as this whole intervention in Eastern Congo continues, which is, what's the long-term strategy of Paul Kagame? Because we saw, you know, some months back that there were beginning to be Rwandan officials talking about the fact that, you know, Rwanda's borders in the past were bigger than they are today, and that, you know, the colonial division of Africa had sort of meant that, you know, a lot of Rwandans were living outside Rwanda's borders. And that quite rightly and quite understandably raised all sorts of concerns, in that people were sort of saying, okay, is that the plan? Is the plan then to annex the Kivus? Is M23 going to be the puppet government of Kagame? And I think, you know, the longer that displacement goes on, the longer the M23 movement is in occupation of that area, the more that question will be asked. And you know, these are borders that were guaranteed by the African Union. You know, when the OAU was set up, one of the founding agreements was that international border, the borders that had been agreed, you know, by the colonial powers would be respected. And I know that there are places in Africa where that, you know, that has been challenged by historical reasons. But this is a very dangerous game to play. And a lot of African leaders, and certainly a lot of Western leaders, will be looking at this and thinking, is that something that we want to encourage? The idea that, you know, a military leader with an effective army can just reach out into his neighbor's territory and seize whatever he feels is owing to him. And I don't think that's a trend that either the West or the African Union will want to encourage.
Yes, thank you. Let's move on to Jean-Paul. Jean-Paul, can you hear me?
Yes, excuse me. Yes, I can hear you. Hi, Denise. Hi, Michela.
Go ahead.
Jean-Paul.
Hello.
Hi. So my question was triggered by your mention about how Labour Party is blaming the Conservatives and sparing Kagame, kind of. And my concern, or maybe should we as Rwandan be concerned, even though the asylum deal might be dead, But then the Labour Party, given the past partnership and alliance with the government of Rwanda and Kagame in particular, that maybe they may find a way to fund his government through the budget support that they used to do in the past, which might be supporting him in his dictatorship and the war in Congo as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Jean-Paul. I think that's a very legitimate concern, and I have the same questions. And because I'm not I'm a journalist who's always worked in abroad, I don't have the contacts in the Labour Party to know what the thinking is. But I did raise this this very question just recently with somebody who has had a lot of contact with David Lammy's office and the people who are now running the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and I sort of said, you know, can we expect, you know, okay, the asylum deal is dead, but can we expect the same kind of proactive, very positive policy towards Rwanda that we saw in the past with people like Claire Short, who was obviously a Labour minister, had a very close relation with both Kagame and Museveni, a very warm relationship with them. And we also saw, you know, the Tony Blair, our former Prime Minister, the Blair Foundation has done a lot of work. You know, it's sent technical experts to work in Kigali, and you know, Blair's sort of warmth of relationship with Kagame is well known. So it is a big question mark whether or not, you know, we're going to see the asylum deal scrapped, but yet a continuing close collaboration with Rwanda of the sort we saw in the past, where, you know, famously during the Blair years, we saw a lot of financial support for Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, for Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and for Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. That was the kind of trio. They were called the donor darlings. And I just don't know. But as I said, when I raised this with somebody who follows Labour Party politics more closely than I did, he said, well, at the moment, I can tell you that the feeling in the Labour Party is so negative towards that whole asylum deal that it's souring and tainting any sort of relationship with Rwanda, that it sort of comes with baggage. You know, there's a sort of feeling of Rwanda is associated with this disreputable, morally reprehensible deal, and therefore, you know, that won't be forgotten. However, you know, even if Yvette Cooper is not saying anything rude about Paul Kagame and his human rights record right now. So I think we're going to have to just keep watching and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michela. And thank you to Jean-Paul Turayishimiye, Jean-Paul Prudence Senga, and Eric Ngoga for your precious participation in this conversation. As much as we would like to continue, our time is up for today. Thank you, everyone who tuned in, and many thanks to our amazing guest, Michela Wrong. Michela, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Denise. And it's really nice to have a slightly more relaxed way, you know, of talking about these things. And it's been nice. Thank you.
Let me close by saying that after all the horrors that Rwandans have experienced, they deserve a democratic state and a government that obeys the rule of law. The rule of law. Paul Kagame's tyranny has cost us so many lives in Rwanda and abroad. It is time for the whole world to know what really goes on in Rwanda and Paul Kagame's dictatorship. But it is highly time for Rwandans all over the globe and anyone who believes in justice to speak up against injustice. It is time for the international community to stand up and stand on the right side of history and stand up for justice and peace. Like I said last time, collaborations between Western countries and African countries should be based on respect, mutual economic benefit, and humanity. But of course, it won't happen if no one takes action. As we say in Kinyarwanda, Imana ifasha uwifashije, God helps those who help themselves. I urge everyone who believes in an open political space, equal rights, justice, and rule of law to break the silence. We must speak up and stand up against tyranny, against injustice, and against the brutal dictatorship of Paul Kagame. See you all next time, and thank you for listening.